Hello and welcome to a very special conversation on South Asians' women's perspective on freedom and partition, which is curated by the Citizens Archive of Pakistan. Today we have with us Aaliyah Tayyebi from Project Dashtan, Ganeem Dhillon, curator, Partition Museum, Amritsar, Malvika Bhatia, who's an oral historian at the Citizens Archive of India, and Nival Usman, who's going to be joining us shortly. So my name is Aaliyah Tayyebi, and I will be acting as the moderator and facilitator for the talk. So without further ado, let's get to it. So when we talk about the 1947 partition of South Asia, we know that it is one of the most talked about events in recent history. August 1947 in the subcontinent marks the freedom from the colonial rule and the creation of two nation states, Pakistan and India. The partition also marks the largest mass migration in human history and the displacement of nearly 18 million people across both borders. Today, as we talk about the 1947 partition, I would like us to focus on the voices of the feminine. When we reflect on the feminine in our history, by and large, the sound of violence and trauma incurred by the women muffles the voices of strength, courage, and resilience of the 50% of our population. Women at the time of partition reshaped the basic structure of our society, from taking over public spaces to becoming the sole protectors of their families. History is full of unique stories of bravery and strength of the women of the region. Today, as we converse, I would like us to look at these stories of bravery as the lens through which we capture the spirit of freedom. So the questions that I have today are, how does our history represent the women of the region? And is it a fair representation? As historians, how have we understood and disseminated the voices of the feminine? Is there something unique to be learned from the feminine perspective? And how can we aid to this quest? So with these questions, I'd like to start. So Ganeem, let's start with you and hear what you have to say, and then we'll move forward. So Ganeem, over to you.
Thank you. So on the first question, whether history has been a fair representation, I think since history is very dependent on who is telling it, and a lot of the history that we grew up hearing was written by men. It was a very political history. And looking at partition history specifically, or the history of the countries today, I think a lot more women are involved in it. And you can see it also represented in the difference of the focus of the stories that has come about. In India specifically, you have Urvashi Bhutalia, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin, who brought in that first, who first looked at the oral histories and focused on the stories of the women in their words, from their representation. And I think that that has changed the narrative a lot. So whether it's not like you can't ever say a history is fairly written unless you have the different viewpoints in place. So I think we have improved from, say, the last 20 years or 30 years. And we're getting there slowly in having more voices being heard.
Fair enough. So, as historians, I remember, for example, that when I go and I collect stories, I don't look at the gender specifically. I am more interested in making sure that the person that I'm interviewing has a bird-eye view or has a witness account. But oftentimes when I bring those stories back home and I'm reflecting on them is when I understand that there is a major difference in the sentiments that are aroused by a certain narrative. And usually when I'm looking at the feminine, I see detail orientation in terms of sound, smell, recollection of certain incidents through a more emotive inference. Whereas when I majorly, by and large, reflect on the masculine narrative, it is more to do with events that were unfolding and is oftentimes a recollection that is shaped by their consciousness in the today that they live. And whereas in women, I feel it is more entrenched in the moment that was. So oftentimes I do come back thinking that feminine has a more apt recollection in terms of that event in time, and not a evolved perspective of what it was. So do you feel something similar when you are collecting the stories? And if you could maybe share something on those lines?
Are you asking me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so um, there's one incident specifically that I'd like to share. Again, as you mentioned, when you go for an interview, you're collecting the larger story, and then when you, but what I've realized often happens is that when people reach out to the Partition Museum, they all often invite us to come and interview their fathers or their grandfathers, and the grandmothers or the aunts or the sisters are not counted in that first invitation. And then when we go to the home, we realize that the wife or the sister or the aunt or the mother is also a partition survivor. And that's a second or a third interview that ends up happening, which is unplanned. The women themselves also often feel that the story that they might be sharing isn't that important, because they say that, hum ghar pe rehte the, we lived at home, we didn't really go out, so we weren't so aware. But then once they slowly start opening up, it brings a completely different perspective to the same narrative that would have already been shared by the men in the family. So in one of the interviews that we did, we interviewed two gentlemen from the same family who had migrated from Pakistan. And they were cousins. They were both quite young children at that time. One was about 15, the other one was about 12 years old. And when I was interviewing them, an old lady came and joined us, and she was much older to them. She was in her 90s at that time. And they introduced her as their bhabi. She was married to one of their elder cousins. She had also migrated with them. And when I asked her that, can I speak to you first, she wasn't very willing. And then she quietly started talking to me after we wrapped up the first two interviews and we were all having tea and packed up the camera. And she brought out another very interesting perspective. The family had been neighbors with Muslims, and the gentleman had mentioned how the fathers had often used to visit the homes. The Muslim and the Hindu family male members interacted with each other, and the children used to play together. And when I asked this lady that did the women also interact with each other, she said that no, they didn't, because they both observed parda. But on the day that they were leaving from their home and they were sitting in the tonga, the Muslim ladies who also kept very strict parda, they came out and they had packed food for the family that was the Hindu family that was migrating. And they handed it over and said that, we know that you don't eat the cooked food that we make, but you are traveling, you don't know where you're going, you don't know how long it'll take, you don't know when you'll get food, and you are traveling with children. So take this food with you. And this lady got very emotional when she was telling that story. And that was not a story I had heard from either of the two male members whom I had interviewed by then. So I think, there's a completely different perspective that you get that rounds out the stories that you hear from just one side otherwise.
Absolutely. So on that note, Sadia, I'd like to come to you and get your perspective on the three questions that we will be discussing today. How does our history represent the women of the region? Is it a fair representation? As historians, how have we understood and disseminated the voices of the feminine? And is there something unique to be learned from the feminine perspective? And how can we aid this quest?
Thanks very much for the introduction, and Hanif, for your thoughts. I don't really see Project Dashtan as something that's academically embedded. So we're at a very different angle of partition studies, because we work as kind of activists, storytellers, filmmakers. So it's a very different perspective on that we take when we go for our interviews. It is still an oral history perspective, but what we're trying to do is kind of like reconnect people to their ancestral homes across the borders. So it's more based in this practical activist effort to kind of create that awareness of a shared history. in that, we obviously have tried to keep a balance of the people that we interview and the stories that we're telling, because we have limited resources to, actually give people these VR experiences of their homes on the other side. So what I will say is that I do not think it's been like a fair effort towards collecting oral histories of women. As Anif said, it's taken us a long time to get there, to understand, well, these are different perspectives and they need to be included for the purposes of diversity, inclusion, etc. So we have made an effort to try to speak to more women in our design of our project. I think one thing to note is that obviously partition studies isn't a new subject. It's been an ongoing effort to record these histories. But what we see is, even though today we have a lot more interest in the stories that women have to tell, it may be too late, because this is a dying generation and we have lost so much time getting those big macro narratives of what was happening, what was your political association, and most of the stories that we've heard come from male histories and male historians, that with that we've kind of lost a big chunk of the people that we can actually interview and get those diverse perspectives. In there, what we see is most of our perspectives are Punjab based, for example, and I understand that that's where the most violence happened, but then we've lost this the diversity of how big an event partition was and how many different perspectives we can actually see. And I think that feminism comes in there as well, that these perspectives that undercut class, that should be about maybe regions, are things that we've come too late to explore. So what we're currently doing is trying to find stories that are not Punjab based, as stories from, for example, South India, the Bay of Bengal communities, the sea border that came up during partition, and cut off communities from Burma, from Sri Lanka, from Singapore. So there's so many perspectives that we haven't seen, and within them, then there's the voices of the women who we might just be too late, or it's too late a realization to actually get those first-hand testimonies. So I think in that sense, if you look at partition as this cross-regional event that is not just the Radcliffe line, then there's a bigger sample of women that we might have missed in the literature, and it might just be too late for that. With how unique these perspectives are, of course, there's we felt that women's histories are centered a lot more around the objects that they brought back, or the generations inherited. If you look at the work that Anchal Malhotra, for example, is doing on objects, a lot of those histories come from the things that women have saved. And we have this very interesting entry into understanding partition through those objects. If somebody brought back a handi, somebody brought back jewelry, shoes, clothes, and I think that also speaks to women's experiences in partition, because those are the things that future generations inherited. They feed back into our cultures of how marriages happen, cultures of music, cultures of eating food. So I think that's something very specific that female perspectives have brought in, the way of life that we had and currently have, and how to link that across generations. The second thing that I note sometimes is that women, when we go to speak to them, they're reluctant to tell their stories. Their first impact is, no, ask my husband, he'll tell you better, because they think the narrative that we want to hear is that grand narrative. What happened, what happened in a village, what was the village sardar, or what was the panchayat, like they think we want to hear that. And then there has to be like a conversation there to know your perspective as the woman is what we want to hear. How did it, how did this was the situation for you? So I do feel sometimes that there's that reluctance, and it comes from these deeply embedded processes of socialization that maybe we need to talk about more, and this intergenerational realization or characteristic that we have. The women don't speak. They're starting off from at that time a lot of them were in the zanana, were in parda, and then now they have this voice, and somebody's asking them these questions. So I think that's my main a contribution here, and this idea of the intersectionality that runs across caste and religion and regions, and these stories that are very important to us, but there's been a reluctance, a hesitancy in getting to those stories.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Malvika, moving on to you, would love to hear your thoughts and reflections on this particular thing, and then we can move on.
So I agree with all of you. I think what everyone has said has resonated so much about, how are women represented. And I'd like to say that, I started, I don't know if all of you started this way, but when I started doing oral histories, and Aaliyah was actually along for that journey with me when I did the first few, I used friends and relatives as my first guinea pig interviews, because my dadi lived in my house and I could make her sit every day, and she hated it. She didn't actually enjoy it very much. And I kind of told her, but I know your stories, yes, and I need to know more. And of course, she did not move during the partition. She was born and brought up in Mumbai, Bombay, as it was then. But what she said resonated with me. She found an old family tree that said that had 8 generations before my great grandfather. And I looked at it and it was all, and I'm sure you all have come across this, it was all men. And I said, what, there's, women are kind of vital to this process of expanding a family. Where are the women? And she said that it just wasn't important to these people. And she was annoyed about it. She's quite traditional, but she was annoyed about it. And I said, but Dadi, I asked you all this. And I said, but why haven't you told me? You've told me so many stories, but why haven't you told me all of this? And she said, who asked us? Nobody cared what my perspective was. I wasn't educated enough. I wasn't, and she was the daughter of, for that time, quite a progressive kind of Gandhian freedom fighter who was very big, who was kind of very involved with the Congress in a big way. She was married at 21 because her father refused to marry her off earlier than that, which is very progressive for the 1950s. So she said, but nobody asked us. She said, nobody cared because our viewpoint wasn't important enough. And I think that to me really hit home, and it's what all of you are saying. And another thing for me, I find that I always thought maybe it's my bias because I'm a woman, but it's the women's stories that I remember when someone asks me, tell us some cool stories that you heard, which is a question that we get often. It's always the women's stories that stick with me. And I always wonder, is it my bias? But hearing all of you today actually makes me think, no, you're right, Aaliyah, when you said it's the women who remember the sights and the smells and the sounds. It's the men who maybe the news that they've read later on, or, the politics of many of the years after may have influenced their opinion. With the women, it's what they knew then. And the fact that no one asked them, and that suddenly sometimes you get really lucky and they just love that you've got all the time in the world to listen to them. And the other thing I think you said about, yes, if they always say, oh, speak to my husband, or speak to, my brother-in-law or whoever. And I find this with certain communities, especially if someone's grown up in a more conservative household. We've done this. We've interviewed husband and wife, and we've had to kind of insist with the wife, please, aap interview de dijiye. We want to know, because your life was very different to your husband's who went out to work. What was it like? And they say no, and they're really reluctant. And if their husbands are in the same room when we're interviewing them, then it is impossible. I find it almost impossible. And we always do the sneaky thing where we say, can we come back tomorrow? And we kind of try to figure out a time when they'll be alone at home, when no husband or son is around. And can we come back? And the interview we get, that second session we get when no one is around, is entirely different. And I think those two things, what my own grandmother told me about nobody asked us, and what these women who are opening up when we ask them in private, are two very, very telling things. So, and I think the fact that these stories stand out because they may be ingrained in that time, as Aaliyah said, are so, they just stick with me because it's always, and it always tends to be surprising. I think with women, we all go in with a certain idea, right? It's our grandmothers, for all of us, it's our grandmother's generation. How did they grow up? What was their education like? All of that. And we find more often than not that they are either barely educated at all or very highly educated because they had progressive parents. It's very rarely kind of I finished school, my matriculation, and then I was married off. It's always I didn't finish my matriculation and then I was married off. So, and with the partition, I think this plays a huge part. I heard a very interesting, I've been trying to track it down in anticipation of this talk. There was the Oral History Association of India has a conference every year. And there was these couple of young students who presented about a village affected by partition. And I was not in town when that was going on. Someone told me, just get on this. It's really interesting. And I kind of joined it from my phone. And they talked about their whole project. And I'm going to try and find it for all of you and for all of us. Their whole project talked about this one village and the partition stories of that village, and how the women said, yes, there was this, before these mobs would come, the men folk would kill the women, those awful stories that you hear. But that's not the story we want to tell. That's not okay. And I thought that's the first time I'd heard that, where a lot of people talk about, to save our honor, we told my so-and-so mommy, chachi, whoever told, their husband that kill me before the mobs come. But they said that, no, that's not acceptable. And I have been determined to track this project down because I really want to know more. And I think that those representations for the longest time, as Ganeep said, except maybe in the last 10, 20 years, those representations are sorely missing. Even when I know in India, I don't know, Aaliyah, maybe you've experienced this across the border as well, that when we learn about even when they talk about Gandhi and women joined his movement, but that's the sentence in your textbook. Women joined his movement. But what did they do? What was their role? Surely it was, if it's so important that we have to mention women separately, that they joined the freedom movement or that they were affected by the partition, what was their role in that? And I'm talking about the freedom movement a lot as well, because we're actually not specifically a partition archive, and maybe don't do as many partition interviews as you. We interview people around that generation. And so partition interviews form, of course, a part of that, but we don't go looking for them simply because actually you guys already do such a great job. So we have a few, but just there are women who also maybe didn't migrate, but did see that time, did see the violence, and those, and I find that the women's experience, or the way the women saw that time, was very, very different than the men. It maybe affected them more. They were, what they did in terms of whatever they could, even from inside their houses, even from behind pardas, is quite incredible. And that's how I feel that it is, yes, and so very important that we tell these stories.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Malvika. Naval, so most of the experiences that we've had, and most of the conversation thus far has been about oral histories and how we, when we reflect on our history and try to disseminate it, are looking at it from a different lens and have understood, because we have gone and spoken to men and women, the different nuances that both cover. When we talk about academics purely, and now I'm going to become very blaze about it and be like, it's just like a story that is presented to you without much gender discrimination per se. But even having said that, we often do feel that it is gendered. It is more masculine, the narrative, the story in its totality. So as a professor and as an academic, when you look at this, what do you feel, and what have you unearthed thus far?
Thank you, Aaliyah. I think that perhaps an appropriate place to start the discussion would be by acknowledging sort of two trends that we see in the colonial period. The first one is that the British experience in India had the effect of polarizing, gender identities and sexual differences. So the British imagination was not very comfortable with sort of the fluidity, that existed with regard to gender norms and sexual norms, and it wanted to sort of take India back to a time where gender identities were more sort of tightly defined. What they interpreted to be sort of, the traditions and the customs of India and the religions that they found within India. And this, of course, was part of a larger sort of preoccupation of the British to compartmentalize and categorize the subjects, whether by sort of according to religion or ethnicity or by caste, and accordingly also according to their gender binaries. So, for example, the colonial imagination was not comfortable with the category of Khwaja Saras. they wanted to fit sort of people very tightly into either male or female. So that's the first sort of trend that we need to bear in mind. And the other thing that we need to bear in mind is the fact that the colonial imagination had a decided preference for the masculine over the feminine. So, and that obviously had something to do with the fact that the colonizer considered itself to be sort of the masculine, whereas the colonized were, the female or the feminine. Equally, it's also important to remember something that is mentioned time and again in historiography, which is that the British tended to categorize the local population also in various ways. One of those ways were that the subjects that they favored the most, for example, Punjabi landowning castes, the Sikh community, they had sort of decidedly more masculine traits. So they were tall and well built, broad, and they were referred to as the sort of naturally martial castes or the warrior castes. Whereas the other sections of the population, such as Bengalis, etc., were not as favored by the British because they were considered to be shorter or perhaps not sort of as broadly built, etc. So these two trends have to be kept in mind. That there was a sort of pushing towards binaries as far as gender differences were concerned on the one hand, and on the other hand, then there was sort of this admiration or celebration of what was considered masculine over what was considered feminine. And so in a way, sort of the colonial experience paves the way for which voices are going to be heard within the locals, amongst the locals, and which voices are going to be repressed or suppressed later on, in the latter half of the colonial experience, as well as the decolonization process. So the way is already paved for the masculine narrative to emerge, sort of decidedly over and above, the voice of the females, the voice of women. So just sort of carrying on from where my colleagues left off, I think it's important to point out that the absence of the voice of women sort of cuts across class, and it also cuts across sources. So whether you're looking at oral sources or archival sources, and it also cuts across communities. You're talking about the Muslims or the Hindus or the Sikhs, and equally interestingly, as well as the British are concerned as well. So even in sort of the archival sources related to sort of the viceroy or the various governors of various provinces, or the Secretary of State, the fortnightly reports that the governors are writing to the Secretary of State or the viceroy, the sort of women are conspicuous because of their absence. So women are not writing, and women are also not mentioned in sort of the writing or the letters or the reports that are being sent back and forth from India to Britain. And I think it's also important to point out that when Pakistan was created, there were only two women in the Constituent Assembly. The first one was Begum Jahan Ara Shah Nawaz, and the second one was Begum Shaista Sohrawardi Ikramullah. And the two women are, well, a couple of things that have to be sort of noted here. Firstly, they're there because they're from political families, they have political connections, and they're sort of attached or affiliated with male counterparts, who are either sort of in the same class or category, such as sort of the landowning elites, which is the general sort of group that Begum Jahan Ara Shah Nawaz belongs to, or attached to other important political figures, as Begum Shaista Ikramullah is. And the other thing that needs to be noticed about these two ladies, the only two ladies in the Constituent Assembly, is that the role that they take up and the sort of legislation that they take up in the Constituent Assembly, or the kind of mention that you see, is more to do with sort of welfare and education, etc., right, rather than sort of outright political sort of agenda, or taking up a political stance. You sort of see them being cast in a slightly sort of softer role, and this is obviously equally true, if not more so, for Fatma Jinnah, who takes up the cause of the refugees. And if you sort of read up about Fatma Jinnah, it's more to do with rehabilitation of refugees, and more sort of the welfare aspect of it, not really as far as sort of taking up the agenda of the refugees as a political cause. and the resettlement and all the political issues that arose with regard to refugee resettlement, that is not where you hear Fatma Jinnah's voice. Where you hear Fatma Jinnah's voice and Fatma Jinnah's role is in a much sort of softer place, where you talk about sort of giving them food and giving them aid and giving them sort of medicine. So there are certain roles that are carved out for women to occupy, which are acceptable, which are softer, which are more palatable, whereas a sort of more overtly political agenda is conspicuously, missing.
So yeah, just picking on what Naval was talking about, that is one of the things that I have. When I started oral histories, like most of you, I wasn't really paying attention, particularly to the nuances or the lack of the feminine. But this was a question that I often asked myself. That when we talk about the feminine, it's just a mention. It's like a footnote, right? But there is not much spoken of in terms of their achievements or their work. And even when we talk about their achievements, it's literally like we put them in a box of acceptable behavior. And if they fit into that box of acceptable behavior, we are okay with acknowledging them or praising them. But if they are not fit in that mold that we have put for them, then we're not very comfortable with sharing that. For example, when I reflect on partition and the sound of the feminine, by and large, the overwhelmingly deafening sound is the sound of violence and rape and the killing and the suicides. I very rarely hear of an acknowledgement of their bravery, of their courage, of their resilience, which is also as important, if not more, than the stories of violence. I remember so many stories that I have come across where women talk about taking over a very dominant patriarchal system, redefining it, because oftentimes the husbands are already migrated. So they have taken over the little children and oftentimes other people from their neighborhoods and moved, and taken that journey, whether by foot, whether by train, or by motor cars or ship. I mean, I remember one of my most favorite stories of migration is of this woman who traveled from India into Pakistan. She was from a lower income group, moved from Meerut to Pakistan, and she remembered that the last belt of her journey was crossing over Sindh, into Sindh, and she did that on a camel. And she spoke to me about how that 3-day journey was all about. And when she got off the camel, she could not walk for so many days. And I mean, she spoke about not having eaten for 3 days and being like a camel herself, had just stocked up whatever little food she had before she had gotten on the journey. And that kind of made me understand the trauma, not just of losing something or starting something afresh, but the actual trauma of the journey. And I felt like I had interviewed many other people, some men in that, who had spoken to me of traveling by camel, but the way she described it was so much more poignant and so much more in depth than I had. And for me, that was truly a story of bravery. And then when we talk about history, not just being about events, but also combining different elements that existed around you to create a larger picture, we often forget little stories, right? I remember this one story where this woman said that they were supposed to migrate from India into Pakistan, and it was Ramzan at that time, a holy month for the Muslims. And she had prepared these velvet shalwars. And she said that suddenly her father came and said that you have to move out right this minute. And everybody literally just left, and probably like 2 minutes into the walk, she ran back home and opened her cupboard and pulled out those shalwars. And her emotion at that moment in time was that I'm going to this new country and it's going to be Eid, and what am I going to wear? So that in itself is so much talking of the hope that you have for the new destination. It is these little nuances that often reflect on the journey, right? And so for me, it's not just about representing a missing sound into the narrative, but it is actually adding more depth, flavor, and reflection into the whole event. If you want to recap the 40s and the 50s for the region, then I question myself, how can I do a just job if I am consciously not counting for the 50% of the population? And that is something that affects me as a human, as a historian, as a person who's saying that, oh, I'm doing this, but then how can I do justice to it if I am, kind of not wanting to acknowledge such a large population? And that is something that I want us to talk about and wanted to understand. How do you feel on that? So anyone who'd like to shed more light on that, the floor is open.
I think, if I may, you're right that, this story you told me about the shalwars, I've heard something very similar, where there was a young family walked from their house to the port in Karachi and left and came to India. And she said, my mother wore 4, 5, 6 saris, one on top of the other, because how do you bring your clothes back, and how do you bring a baby back, and all of that, and it was our Muslim friend who helped us, took us till the port so we wouldn't be harmed. Yes, you hear all those kinds of stories. I think another story, you're right, that 50% of the population, and especially because women speak with so much feeling and so much memory, sort of vividly of that time. I remember a story of someone, a Sindhi, and to listen to, and we'll get a lot of Sindhi stories being based in Mumbai, not so many of the violence in Punjab and in Bengal. We get a lot of the Sindhi stories, and they're heartbreaking, saying, but my motherland is, it's all of it is across the border. We didn't get any of it, and it kind of gets you every time, and that need to keep that identity, and it's so, it's always difficult to listen to. And there was this lady, completely uneducated, and they actually lived there till the 70s, I think, till they had to come back. And but she was completely uneducated, and they were landowners, and all she knew was her home, and then she had to leave it. She didn't know anything outside that, because they were confined to their home, and then they had to leave it, and they had to come to Bombay. And she now lives in a flat in South Bombay. She says, nothing like my life there, which I left not very long ago. The 70s is, it doesn't feel as far away as, when people told you, okay, we migrate in the 40s. And she said, I just do the same things here, and I make pickles, and I run the house, and it was, but that's a different kind of courage. How do you leave absolutely everything to come to a different home, even if you're coming with the same kind of family, if you know nothing else, if you've not had no education or exposure to the outside world? Can you imagine? It always gets me, how scary must it have been to leave everything and just move? And that, we've all felt homesick at some point, and it always makes me think that much homesickness, to know that you can never go back, is just, it always gets me. So these are 2 stories that are actually from yours, and you're completely right that you can't ignore 50% of the population, because they felt fear in a different way. A man might have thought, how can I take care of my family? How am I going to earn money? A woman might have thought, what am I going to do in a place where I don't know anyone? How do I run a house in a place like that? And I think that it's, and without education, which a lot of them didn't have, an exposure, that becomes even harder. I think the fear must be gripping, is, how I imagine it.
Absolutely. And like, if we are talking about the events of the 40s, then obviously partition has to be discussed. And I respect that and I understand that. But when we talk about partition and when we talk about survival, we tend to forget one of the most important aspects of survival, which is food and water. And if you look at it from a micro angle, you often do understand that without food, survival would have not been possible. And oftentimes it's a journey of a day, because of the problems of partition, was taking much longer. People were in a state of journey for often for a week, for 10 days, sometimes even a month, because they were constantly stopping and then moving forward again. And nobody actually acknowledges that they always had food. And where did that come from, right? So I know that oftentimes when I go and speak to women and ask them, or I speak to men and I ask them, like, how did you fill your belly? And they would say, oh, we had some food that we had brought with us. And then when I asked them to go back in time and tell me who did that, where did it come from, who thought of it? So it always is largely the feminine who's thinking about the basic survival. And when you talk about that 18 million people were displaced, those 18 million people must have needed food for survival. So if that number is a static, then how can you ignore the person or the gender that made sure that everybody was, fed? I mean, like we all know that, like you told me the story, Ganeep, of the neighbors giving them food. It was the women who thought about it. Similarly, when we talk about families who were moving, it was the elder dadis or the nannies or the other aunts who weren't coming, who were making jars and cartons of food to be taken with them so that the children could eat. And it was not the children only who needed food for survival, it was everybody, right? So I feel these are the certain things that we often forget when we look at the strength of the feminine, because it is just taken for granted like everything else around us. Sadia, I have a question for you. So, like I know that Project Dashtan is mostly focused on recreating the laws, but when you talk about recreation and then you talk about the micro angle of objects or emotions or experiences, in your experience, has there been a difference in the details of the imagination when you look at the feminine or the masculine, or have you never really actively looked at it?
I think we've actively sought out female stories. Coming back to your conversation about trauma, um, uh, the way that we think about trauma is that just the mere act of leaving your home and leaving everything behind is traumatic. And what we are trying to do is to find the empathy today to listen to those stories, to say okay, the story doesn't have to be of a train on fire, of a village burning down. Just the story of say, we heard this one story of a woman who had to, her husband was posted somewhere else and she had to make the journey alone with her children to Pakistan. And in that journey, this woman, she's still alive. She was safe. She wasn't attacked. She was able to come safely. Took a train, but just the fear that she was talking about, this specific nature of that fear when you're a woman. There's these very specific things that come up that even the oral historian doesn't really know it, but when we go back and transcribe, we're like, well, this is different, this was a different experience for this person. And imagine the number of women who actually had that experience, the number of women who had to travel alone, the number of women who, for example, may have been pregnant during that journey. And then on top of that, there is a layer of taboo, that there are things that we can't talk about. We still today in Pakistan can't openly talk about the rapes that happened, and this is the issue of pregnancy, the issue of, well, what was happening, because these women, so many women might have been menstruating during this time period. What was that process like? What was that experience? And because of those taboos, we can't really understand those experiences, because we just can't talk about them. And so I feel that when we're collecting these histories for someone to read, for someone to understand, right? And if there's no empathy for someone to listen to that story, to be able to listen to, it's easier to listen to the story of a village burning down and train full of bodies than it is to hear about the story of a woman who gave birth on 14th August while she was on a Tonga leaving her home, right? So can we have that empathy, and how do we as activists, as storytellers, build that empathy, or the way that we tell those stories that maybe men's brains don't turn off? So there's this whole different dynamic of, yes, we know the history that existed then, we're trying to record it, but is anybody interested today to actually hear it, to engage with it? If tomorrow we bring out a documentary, or we're making animations as well about a female experience, are men today willing to hear that experience, to sit through that? And so there's that impact, that connection I will make with contemporary audiences today, and that's grounded in the way that we perceive feminist stories, female perspectives, and is anybody even listening to us? So I think what I'm trying to even say is that there has to be, for us as historians, this insight into intersectionality or the subaltern, and intersectionality as exists with classes of women. There's these stories of women who where you have the experience of the Zanana, but come from higher income backgrounds, who we had this one interview with this lady who was able to charter a flight because her father or grandfather was somebody important, and she came on a plane to Pakistan. And then there's these other stories, as we just heard, this woman trying to travel on a camel. So there's also a very intersectional difference, and because we're not there yet with our audiences, with the funding that we get to do this kind of research, a lot of that nuance is going to continue to get lost, not just in women's stories, but just generally stories of the subaltern as well. Everybody who made it to Pakistan and survived till today, there's socioeconomic factors that maybe allowed them to survive. Imagine the number of people who didn't survive till today, those lost generations, those lost stories that we now can't have insight into. So I think it's a very complex question of, what does a feminist history of partition have to offer? And the silences that are characteristic of women's experiences and women in academia and the way that we do research, they continue to impact us today. And I don't think anybody is like putting their finger on the problem, that how do we actually make this research matter to future audiences as well.
Absolutely. So, so for me, one of the most important things and one of the most important reasons for collecting oral histories is that, if you look at partition, I personally look at it, and this is from my understanding of going and speaking to so many people about it and reading so much on it, is that it is a event in our history which was never processed, which was never discussed, like a taboo. And because it was never processed or discussed, nobody understood how deep a wound it was. And because no one ever acknowledged it as a wound, nobody actively thought about healing. And most of the problems arise from the basic simple fact that because no one addressed it as a wound, nobody thought of healing. And so oftentimes when we go and speak to people about their partition stories, one of the things that comes across is like, why do you want to know? And then the other thing is like, when they start talking, it's like they did not even realize that they were sitting on so much information, so much emotion that needed to be shared, whether that be masculine or feminine, right? And it's often like a catharsis for them, that it makes them kind of cleanse and reflect and look at things from a very different perspective. I mean, I know that for me, a lot of times when I go and speak to people, they get so overwhelmed with emotion that they break down, and then they need to kind of take a moment back to gather their thoughts and gather their senses back into the present and then continue their story. If something is so emotive, if something is so painful, even after 75 odd years, and then you take away 50% of the emotion, then what are you presenting? Because my question, remember, like I asked you guys 3 questions. One of the questions that I have been putting to myself, and I would love to put to you, is that as historians, how do we aid the quest? I know that we're running out of time. I know that most of our partition generation is lost. And obviously we can't go and alive the people who are no longer with us. So mortality is a problem, but the people who do exist, people who do have had experiences, there are still quite a lot of them. And as people who are trying to work towards historical documentation, it is extremely important, right, to not just question the absence of, but to add to the absence of, whether that be academic or whether that be, more fluid like oral histories. So I just would love to know what you all feel. Like today we discussed the feminine from a different perspective. We did not talk about the rape and the violence. I mean, there are so many stories of rape and violence. We talked about the absence of the feminine narrative in our histories. What do we feel about it? And as women historians or as women academics, what do we feel we can do to make sure that there is at least a slight ripple? If not a full-blown tsunami, then at least there's a ripple in the whole way we look at things.
I'll go ahead and talk about this. So our work at Project Dashtan is exactly about that. Like, how do we engage a young generation back into this big archive of oral histories that we have? So our project has been trying to get the archive out from under maybe academia and like put it directly, in the line of sight of a younger generation of people who want to learn more and maybe change some views about the other in partition. If you're from India and you're looking at a story of a person who migrated and they've reconnected back to their home in Pakistan, can that change your views on partition, maybe your views on what Pakistan is, and vice versa? So that's been kind of like our core aim, that we want to create some lines of empathy on which the other can listen to the story of the self, and do that in a way that's interesting to them, so that it's not just dusty archives lying in a university. This is like something you can interact with. So we have interactive maps, we're trying to make animations. So one of our projects is to create a VR experience of a journey in a migrant's shoes and kind of put you in that headspace, that this is 1947. You have to escape something, you have options, so we kind of gamify that experience. And then next we're trying to create 2D animations that are fictionalized versions of these experiences of partition. Within that, we are trying to make it collaborative across India and Pakistan. So we have Puffball in Pakistan and Spitting Image in India who are collaborating to make 3 animations. And the content of those animations is untold stories of partition, not off the beaten track. One of those narratives is of course a feature on women and various experiences that does address violence and rape, forced conversion, and just basically the experience of leaving a home, leaving your things, leaving your dresser, your jewelry, and that women experience. It's inspired from, I don't know if you know Begum Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussein's story, where she is called Sultana's Dream. And this story is written in way back in 1806, and it's one of the first examples of feminist science fiction from this region. So we take inspiration from her and her imagination that one day the Zanana doesn't exist and all the men are in the Mardana, and then her imagination of what a beautiful world that is when women are free to pursue their interests, right? And the point is that we want to tell stories that also kind of give agency back to women. We've heard so many stories of loss and horror and the silencing of women. Can we kind of give the mic back into the past of women, so that we can imagine them saying what they want to say, or what they would want, would have imagined their world to have been, if they had more control, if they had more agency at that time. So one of our other stories is focused on telling the story of the Bay of Bengal community through the experience of food and the conversation of a granddaughter and a grandmother, to try to put that, even though that tackles like male histories as well, but can we tell it through the voice of a woman, and what would that retelling sound like, and how can we draw in audiences again, so that we don't lose the male audience, because this layer of taboo, and like nobody wants to hear the female perspective, but kind of bring them in a way that's entertaining, that's can engage a new generation. Because I do feel that it's there's been a lack of engagement with, and currently for my generation that is Twitter obsessed and social media obsessed, nobody is sitting and reading Abdullah Hussein's saga about Udas Nasle. Nobody's now re-engaging with Manto in that generation in the same way that maybe it would have happened in the 60s and 70s. So where is the new literature that kind of speaks to younger audiences? Where's the YA lit that kind of engages people into this? And so Project Dashtan is trying to think about those ways that we can use technology, social media, Instagram, the aesthetic, to kind of to bring back that empathy, to kind of build that peace with these narratives of shared culture.
Absolutely. So here's another thought, right? So even when we talk about the voices of the feminine, there is a patriarchal acceptable voice of the feminine that again feeds into the voices of the others, which is the voices of rape, the voices of forced conversions, forced marriages, and abductions and killing, which kind of further isolates the people, right, into us versus them, right? And if you talk about the incidents, or if you talk about the stories of them coming together, like your story of the Muslim women giving food to the Hindu women who were traveling for the children. Now, this is kind of not us and them, it's just us, you know, like us women need to get together to make sure that our children don't go hungry, right? So I just feel that even in the realm of the larger voices, there is a little space for the women, like, and there was a women's wing, and then the women incurred violence, and there was rape. So these are just acceptable versions of feminine that exist in our history. But, you know, like the minute details or the common stories of partition, where there is solidarity, of homogeneity, of the women community coming together, is often lost. And I feel maybe that is something that one can look at and try to promote, so that there is not just that 10% space given to women where they are still talked of as others, as these creatures who needed to be saved, or these creatures who brought shame, but as women who actually existed in this region and had a role to play. And on that note, Naval, I would love to know, like, when you look at academics and when you look at the sound of the feminine, what are the thoughts that come to your mind if I were to ask you to take it on its head and reshape it, so that there is not just the sound of the feminine, but it is an actual reasonably decent representation of the feminine? So how would you look at that?
I think from sort of an academic point of view, the problem is twofold. The first problem is that the discipline of history has sort of progressed in a way which prioritizes the political, which is political history, rather than other forms of history, so social history, cultural history. Sort of the predominant sort of way in which history as a subject has been understood and has been interpreted, you know, throughout sort of the time that history became a discipline in itself, is political history. That's how we understand history. We look at high politics, we look at sort of, you know, decision makers, we look at political decisions, interactions of states. And this is not just sort of something that's, you know, exclusive to the third world, it includes the first world as well. So if you look at the sort of British papers, I'm talking about archival sources, the transfer of power, the sort of report, they're all male perspectives. There is no woman.
So I think we lost Naval. Hopefully she'll be able to join back in. Talking about that, so there's another thought, right? So when we look at females in our history, especially around the time of partition, we have women who end up becoming role models, women who are very fitting to the societal norm of respectability. And then there are these glamorous women like Lady Mountbatten and others who are used literally as you know, as spice, that extra layer of power to the whole thing. And we are okay with that, a pinch of glamour into our otherwise very black and white, version of politics and history of the region. And it is just by clubbing them, us women, into these two blocks of either respectability or non-respectability that we're losing a lot of our voices. And, so like, oftentimes the question that arises is like, the reason that oral histories are doing so well in terms of historical documentation is because they're trying to create a much more larger outlook towards history itself, and not just looking at high politics, but looking at societies, looking at cultures, looking at infrastructure, industry, art, and feeding that all to create a complete picture of what that region could have looked like. Literally, it's literally like doing background work for a film set. And it's like, and a lot of times when something is missing, people take the liberty of adding what they feel should have been, rather than going out and figuring out what it actually was. Exactly in the same ways, when the feminine is added into the narrative, it's added just like that, as a man adding a line saying that, oh, she existed, and she did something, but we don't know what. And I want to know, like, and that could be our closing. I would love to come to each one of you and take it, is when we look forward from this point and we try to readdress the balance of the feminine and the masculine in our history, what do we actively want to pursue? And what do we actively believe could aid in making sure that there is, if not equal, then at least a marginally better representation of the feminine in our history?
So I think like one of the things is exactly what I think everybody here is doing, but also outside, which is just getting more women voices in. And then what you realize is that, you have small realizations when you start collecting these stories. Like, for instance, taking on from Anshul Malhotra's work that Sadia mentioned, you see the objects that the women carried versus the objects the men carried. There is often a difference. So we mentioned during this talk, the clothes that women brought. So it's often like their wedding clothes or expensive clothes. They also brought across utensils, because we were discussing food, right? Like, they were the ones who had to think about how they will feed their families. So they brought across thalis and the glasses and the katoris. And the men brought across the property papers and the educational certificates, because they were the more educated ones and they had to apply that. And even as we lose the voices, there are a lot of those objects that are still present in the families, and those stories have been passed down, that this my grandmother brought across. And those stories are connected with the objects and bring forward the women's voices in certain ways. Another is the fact that, like, even when you look at, when the men speak of violence, which you mentioned, they speak about how the women were said that kill us first, and we don't want to lose our honor. But when you speak with the women who are still around, and even though they were really young, they were like, even the really young ones were 4 years, 5 years old at that time. A lot of the interviews we've done, the women talk about the fear they felt when they overheard their parents talking that, oh, if we are attacked, put kerosene on yourself, they're telling their wives that put kerosene on yourself and on our daughters and burn them, or go to the 3rd floor and jump off. And I remember this one woman clearly saying that till then we had been brought up to believe in the sanctity of life. And then suddenly we were told that our life was not worth living. And in her head, that was a huge change that she suddenly had to deal with, and that she hadn't made her peace with even 70 years afterwards. When she was speaking about it, she was extremely emotional. So I think those stories make people think again about the stories that you've grown up hearing about the honor and women jumping in. Another aspect that, that can be researched, even though we don't have so many first-hand accounts anymore, is about the women who chose to perhaps stay on. And there were lots of complicated reasons why they might choose that. Even after being abducted, they chose to stay on with their abductors for many different societal reasons, sometimes economical reasons. As Sadia mentioned, there was a lot of classism at play. For a poor woman who had been abducted, who might have been offered a better life,
she may choose to stay on. There's been some writing on it. You have Kamla Patel, who's written this book, which was recently translated a few years back into English, called Torn from the Roots. And she looks at, she brings in that gray areas that you mentioned, where the men in the Indian Constitution Assembly are talking about the rehabilitation and the return of the women and the women's body to the Indian country, and the Hindu and the Sikh body, which needs to be brought back. While Kamla Patel talks about the women's voice in this, that, I felt wrong forcing them to come when they didn't want to come, or forcing a Muslim woman to leave when she didn't want to leave. But the panel that is sitting there is 3 men sitting there and saying, no, this is the law and this needs to be followed. So I think even bringing forward those stories adds a lot of like finer points, nuance to the stories that we've all grown up hearing. And I think like just bringing, like at the Partition Museum, when we're doing our walkthroughs and the stories that we bring forward, one of the things we try and leave with our visitors is that it doesn't matter if whether your family migrated or did not migrate, whether they suffered or did not suffer, but just go back and talk to your family members who are still around, and especially talk to the women in your family, because that's not a story you would have heard. And that is a realization that I have seen on the faces of people when I'm talking to them and mentioning it to them, because it doesn't come across as an obvious thing. Because as we discussed, women don't want to put forward their story. They will quietly sit there and listen to the men folk in the family talk. But if given an opportunity, they obviously do have stories to tell. They have their own version of history to share. So even if we can just encourage people to go and speak to their own family members, it doesn't need to be shared. It doesn't need to be put on a public platform, but just to be carried forward as a family memory, as a family history, and passed on to the next generations. I think that adds to our society as a whole in terms of how we deal with everything that affects us politically, socially, culturally, and how we grow up.
Absolutely. Sadia?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think on the question of what we can do better, I think that should include male academics and male activists as well. Because I feel that, women's history is not a feminine history or a female history. It is our history, just the way that we've accepted that these male narratives are our history. The female narratives are also our history, right? So it's just there has to be some change in the mindset that this is accepted as history as well. And within that, I think just like this idea of what is the value of life, that we still grapple with today in contemporary societies as well, that is a woman's life not worth living, which has already been mentioned. And and similarly, if you speak about intersectionality, there's so many links that we can make with women's stories that cut across other ideas of classes, of minority religions, and we have these experiences of the vulnerable, of the minority, that can speak to each other. And it's strange to say that 50% of the population is a minority, but that's the experience of being a woman in South Asia. So I think that kind of conversation around what is the value of life, because women's experiences of partition are not just experiences of before 70 years ago. These have been carried on into our intergenerational traumas, our memories, etc. So just what Ghaneeb was talking about, that these women who were kidnapped, force converted, raped, and then had to accept the religion of the other, then had to be repatriated back to, say, India. And once they were repatriated back, they were soiled goods. They were not accepted as productive members of society. And those narratives, that because of this layer of taboos that we just can't talk about, that these women didn't want to come back. They had accepted that. They knew that coming back home would never be the same for them. They would never be accepted into society. And that experience speaks to these other experiences of people who remained, say, in Pakistan, converted to Islam, but were never accepted by the Muslim society as converts. The way that we have pejorative terms about Christians in Pakistan, for example, and those come from the experiences of partition. And Nival, I'm sorry, he keeps cutting out, but she was talking about these colonial technologies of creating classes and creating differences, where the caste system as it was created or enumerated by the British feeds directly into our modern day biases against Christian communities, against Dalit communities. So just this idea of whose life are we valuing and what is the value of life, I think that's something that we need to, as activists, keep grappling with, that these stories are worth telling. These are our histories. It's a history of a Christian woman, but this is our history, just the way that you've accepted the history of the privileged Muslim politician as being your history, and not these other stories not being a footnote in well, these people also joined the freedom movement and a part of the Muslim League. And it's a big problem because in Pakistan, we learn the history of the Muslim League, and that's the history of partition. Whereas in India, as you learn about the Congress, and the Muslim League is a footnote. So from the greatest macro levels to the smallest grassroots levels of research, there are these demarcations that have been made, that are political decisions in academic history, that we kind of need to resolve, so that future narratives are inclusive, are intersectional.
Absolutely. Malvika?
I think yeah, absolutely what both Garib and Sadia have said. And I think that what Ganeep said really hit home, because I have this conversation with my interviewees' families all the time, because they come and said, oh, so-and-so told you this, but we never knew. We never thought to ask. And it happens that, and I would say to Sadia, she said that you can't speak about certain taboos, menstruation, this and that. So what we've started to do to bring those stories out is to actually just throw caution to the wind and ask, what happened when you menstruated? We now ask it, and we always preface it at the CAI with, I'm going to ask you a very personal question. And we've now started asking men about it as well. What happened when your wife, when your sister was made to sit in a separate room? Didn't you notice? Didn't you ask why she's sitting in that room for 3 days? And a lot of the men will say, well, no, we didn't. We never thought about it then, but we think about it now. I'm talking about 90-year-old men who you wouldn't ordinarily ask these questions to, but we started asking. We started being a little shameless about asking, if that's, I don't know how else to say it, because we are going to lose these stories and because they're so important. And what happens when we start asking, we find that most people do tell. We've not had a person yet who said, no, I find it too personal, I'm not going to tell you. It's never happened. And what's happened with this also, I've noticed, we said that men are influenced by maybe what has happened later, and their memory is influenced by that, and not so much women. But in one respect, I have found where women have been influenced by the news in recent times. A few years ago, the Me Too movement really took off. And I've had a lady tell me about, she didn't say it in so many words, we assume it was sexual assault. And we'd asked her about this menstruation, taboos, this, that, and she said, this happened to me. And she was in tears, and obviously, like Aaliyah said, we don't talk about the trauma of partition. Today we talk about PTSD and this and that, but they obviously faced that as well, this generation. It's not that they came out unscathed, it just wasn't known then. So, so she kind of burst into tears, and her husband was sitting there, and her husband knew that this had happened to her when she was a child. And then there was one more woman who talked to us. And so basically when we handed the interview over to her granddaughter, this couple was very old, and the granddaughter was the one who took care of them. And she said, I'm going to call my whole family over and show it. And I said, wait. I don't think you know that this has happened to your grandmother. Don't call your family over. And I had to tell her, I said, this is what's happened. Please go have this conversation with your grandmother first, if you want, or otherwise, she may not want everyone to. She said, I had no idea. Nobody has any idea. And then her grandfather told her, only I knew. But then there was another lady who faced something similar. And she said, I always used to think it was something to be ashamed of. But now this Me Too thing is coming in the papers, and I've realized I don't need to be ashamed. This wasn't my fault. And it hit us so hard that the kind of, like Gani said, the women kind of are made to keep quiet and sit in a corner. Like my grandmother said, who asked us? Our view wasn't considered important. It just wasn't. We weren't a consideration. Or like Sadia said, to consider 50% of the population a minority is absurd, So we do ask and they do open up, and we find that asking those stories, and we always ask after they tell us the stories, look, we recorded this on camera and a microphone. Do you want us to edit it out? Because you do have to have that much respect for someone's, and we've never got a no. They say, no, I think it needs to be told. And men have started telling us these stories now too. We just kind of ask them, saying, can I ask you about this? Can I ask you what happens when your wife menstruated? And they do answer. And I think that it's important to do that. It's never been awkward or embarrassing. I think that generation, sometimes I find way more open-minded than even we are in certain respects. And Sadia's right that, you know, so whether you're talking about, you know, you're talking about caste and class and all of that plays a big part. And when we talk about the partition, we always talk about Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, but we forget that Hindu, Muslim, Sikh is a very colonial thing. They didn't think in Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian. You know, this was my neighbor. This was my friend. Yes, okay, you know, I had someone tell me that, yes, on Eid, my Muslim friends would always send mithai over before it entered their house because they knew we didn't cook meat and they cooked meat. And it wasn't a politically incorrect thing to say. It was just a matter of they respected each other, and we kind of are up in arms about it today. And we just forget that I am a Hindu and you are a Muslim, or you are a Sikh or I am a Christian, is a very, very British almost demarcation. You know, our grandparents' generation did not worry about it, not until the partition. You know, and we have people tell us that. I had someone tell me that, yes, a Muslim friend helped us out. He bought up all our property. So we came to India and we had money in our hands when we did that. We knew we had to sell everything in Karachi off. But if you tell me today, yeah, I am a little biased, you know, if I think about that I am a Hindu and they are a Muslim. I am biased because of what I saw in the larger picture. But a Muslim has helped me out. It's a really odd kind of, and you know, even they don't know kind of how to reconcile with it. And like I said, I find that generation is a lot more tolerant. And so if you ask these questions about taboos, I think that women's history, let's face it, is never going to be written in, I don't know if it, well, let's not say never. I don't know if in our generation is going to be written in our school textbooks, if it's not just going to be, and women participated too, you know. I think our roles are vital in that, and the role of individuals, like Ganesh said, to ask, just go ask your grandparents, what did you think? And you'll find it's not so embarrassing, and they're not so unwilling to share, and that you should know where you came from and what, you know, what traditions what they grew up with, and what your identity is. And I think that's really important. So I think one way to do it is ask the taboo questions. It's okay.
Absolutely. Nepal, over to you.
Just sort of carrying on from where I left off last time, I was talking about the sort of methodological difficulties in extracting, you know, sort of the voice of the feminine when you study history or you write history. And there are 2 or 3 things that I wanted to highlight. The first one was the general sort of importance that political history has been given over social and cultural history. And obviously the role of women in politics being minimal, you know, that voice just doesn't sort of emerge, because the mold that you're kind of trying to cast history into as a discipline, women don't come in that mold. You know, they fit into sort of social and cultural history. You know, nobody's asking for social and cultural history. Until recently, I think the sort of the impression was that nobody's interested in reading social and cultural history either. So it was dependent on the audience as well. They wanted to hear about the important people, you know, the decision makers doing important things. The other thing is, as you know, the rest of the participants have already mentioned, just to sort of mention it again, it's very difficult to persuade women that people are interested in what they have to say. As somebody who's gone sort of to Punjabi villages and spoken to sort of normal, you know, women working in fields, etc., their general sort of attitude is to sort of divert the question, you know, Sanu ke pata, hame kya pata? Go and ask sort of the men, you know, go and ask the men. They're the important people. They will tell you. Even as something as sort of commonsensical as, you know, who sort of paid the money to pave the roads in your area, or who set up the dispensary, or other sort of general knowledge things. The idea is to sort of just divert the question onto the men. So which leaves a vacuum, right? When the voice of the women is not emerging because they don't consider their voices to be important or worthy of hearing, that leaves a vacuum, which then obviously can be filled up by the masculine voice, which is why you hear of women appearing in the narrative as victims, because that's how men perceive them to be, the honor of the race. the Achilles heel of that particular religion. So that's the voice that emerges because there's a vacuum there, because the women themselves don't consider their voice worthy of being heard. That's the second sort of methodological problem. The third methodological problem is that chronologically, you're not looking at women during the colonial period, you're not really looking at women in the post-colonial period, and then you're sort of expecting the voice of the woman to just emerge in the process of partition. So in that sort of 7 or 8 months of violence, you're kind of expecting the voice of women to emerge out of nowhere. And how coherent is that voice going to be? What is the context, larger context, the long durée in which you're placing that voice? And the only reason that happens is because there's a sudden switch, sort of methodologically problematic switch from high politics to sort of history from below, just for the duration of that partition violence, and then back onto high politics, back onto what's happening in the Constituent Assembly and Ayub Khan and so on and so forth, So there are sort of methodologically these three sort of problems which emerge when you try to extract the feminine voice in historiography or in the sources, because it just doesn't exist. That vacuum is then filled up with the masculine interpretation of women, which is necessarily that of being a victim.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I couldn't agree more. So, like, that is why I think this conversation and many more conversations like this really matter, is because when we talk about partition, we talk about an event in history which is not just high politics. This is an event in which, for a really long amount of time, even historians have looked at social, cultural, and political altogether, right? And I couldn't have put it better than Naval put it, that suddenly in 6 to 7 months, you are trying to create voices for an entity that was 50% of the population that was never given acknowledgement of its existence prior to that. And now suddenly it has a voice, and that also is a voice of the masculine. So the only acceptable voice is the voice of violence, rape, trauma, deaths, because in that, she is the victim, and she as a victim is acceptable, or she as voiceless is acceptable. And I think as historians who are trying to look at partition and trying to look at the formative years of our countries, or looking at projects like these to give understanding of the region, it is important to actively look at the feminine and the masculine both, to create as undiluted as possible a version, or to give an experience to the people of what it was. Like, for example, I remember, like, Nawa, like, I'll tell you so many times it happens to us that women tell us their stories, and then for certain things, they kind of go back to their husbands and be like, hey, I said this, that's okay, right? Or sitting and wanting verification or sort of acknowledgement that what they're saying is right, because they believe that their opinions might not even matter, or they might have looked at it because they have been beaten up into believing that they don't know the whole picture. They have been told time and again that because they were in certain spaces or they weren't exposed to certain spaces, their version of reality is tilted or questionable. And we as women who have gone out and spoken to so many of them have understood that's not the case. On the contrary, they often do bring nuances, perceptions, and stories which we might have overlooked before. So on that note, I would like to thank each and every one of you for taking out time and speaking to me. You were a wonderful group of women. I wish you all the best. And I do hope that we carry on these conversations with each other and around our spaces to ensure that the voices of the feminine are not just something that we pick up on Independence Day, but actually are voices that we actively try and pursue. So thank you, everybody, and have a lovely day.
Thank you, and thank you, Aaliyah and CAP especially. This was great. And stay safe, everyone. Stay well.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.